The morning light filtered through the kitchen window exactly the way Caroline used to like it, hitting the oak table at an angle that made the grain look like flowing water. I sat in the same chair I'd occupied for 37 years of marriage, holding the same blue coffee mug with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the imperfection the way she did with everything broken that still had purpose. 3 years since the funeral, and I still made 2 cups out of habit before catching myself. The second mug sat on the counter, cooling into a daily reminder that some routines outlive the people who made them sacred. The house breathed around me with the familiar sounds of settling timber. Every creak and sigh was a conversation I understood, the soft complaint of the floorboard outside the bedroom where Caroline used to pace when she couldn't sleep, the gentle protest of the front door that swelled in humid weather, the whispered settling of the foundation stones I'd laid with my own hands 42 years ago. I'd built this house the way Caroline dreamed it, room by room, board by board, with the kind of patient attention you give to something you plan to die in. The kitchen faced east to catch the morning sun. The living room had built-in bookshelves where she arranged her mystery novels and gardening magazines in perfect rows. The master bedroom overlooked the maple grove we'd planted the spring after Ethan was born, when everything felt possible and permanent. The gravel driveway announced visitors with a sound like distant applause. I knew every car by its approach: Mrs. Henderson's Buick with the squeaky brakes, Tom Morrison's pickup that needed a new muffler. But this morning brought an unfamiliar hum, the quiet purr of something expensive and new. Through the front window, I watched a black SUV pull into my driveway. German engineering, pristine paint job, the kind of vehicle that made a statement before anyone stepped out. The driver's door opened, and I saw my son for the first time in 8 months. Ethan looked prosperous. That's what Caroline would have called it. His clothes had that crisp perfection of a man who'd never worked with his hands. Charcoal suit, shoes that reflected the morning light, hair styled in a way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. He moved with the confident stride of someone who expected the world to accommodate him. 3 more doors opened. Madison emerged from the passenger side, my daughter-in-law, though she'd never seemed comfortable with that title. Her blonde hair was arranged in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve, and she wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Behind them, an older couple unfolded from the back seat. I recognized them from wedding photos that still sat on Caroline's dresser. Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. Gerald surveyed my property with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched her purse and whispered something to Madison that made my daughter-in-law nod with what looked like satisfaction. The 4 of them stood in my driveway like a delegation, like people who'd come to negotiate terms I hadn't agreed to discuss. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days. Better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright and brittle, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "You look good." "Ethan." I stepped back to let them pass, though something in my chest tightened at the presumption. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." They filed into my hallway with the easy entitlement of people who believed their presence was a gift. The smell of expensive perfume and aftershave filled the air, foreign scents in a house that still held traces of Caroline's lavender soap. "Coffee?" I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host even when hospitality felt forced. "That would be lovely," Patricia said, though her eyes were already cataloging my furniture, my photographs, my life arranged on shelves and walls. I led them to the living room, the space Caroline and I had designed for family gatherings that had become increasingly rare. The oak coffee table I'd built with my own hands, the stone fireplace where we'd spent countless winter evenings, the bay window seat where Caroline used to sit with her knitting, needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. They arranged themselves on the sofa Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric 3 summers ago. I took my reading chair, the one positioned to catch the afternoon light and overlook the maple grove. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Caroline's vision," I said. "She had ideas about everything, down to which trees to plant so they'd frame the view just right." Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. That's actually what we wanted to talk about, Ethan said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in the posture of a man delivering important news. The future of this place. I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. Dad, we're worried about you, Madison began, her voice soft but insistent. Living out here alone, in all this space. The isolation, the maintenance requirements for a property this size. The house seems fine to me, I said carefully. Gerald cleared his throat. Richard, we understand this place has sentimental value, but practically speaking, it's a lot for one person to manage. What if something happens? What if you fall, or have another episode with your heart? Another episode. The heart attack from 5 years ago, reduced to a euphemism that made it sound like a television show that might be canceled. I manage fine, I said. But for how long? Ethan's voice carried that patient tone you'd use with a child. Dad, you're 72. This house has 3 bedrooms, 2 full baths, that workshop you never use anymore. When was the last time you had guests? I thought about the empty bedrooms upstairs, Caroline's sewing room, where her half-finished quilt still waited on the cutting table. The guest room we'd prepared so hopefully for grandchildren who'd never materialized, at least not grandchildren who visited. Space isn't the issue, I said. Isn't it? Madison leaned forward, her expression practiced concern. Richard, you rattling around in all this space, surrounded by memories. It can't be healthy. Patricia nodded sagely. At our age, sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is simplify. There's a lovely senior community in Millbrook, garden apartments, meal service, activities with people your own age. People my own age, I repeated. We're not saying you have to decide today, Ethan said quickly, but we think it's time to start considering options. And Dad, we want to help. There it was, the word that made everything else make sense. Help how? Ethan and Madison exchanged glances. Gerald adjusted his tie. Well, Ethan said, his voice taking on the careful rhythm of a rehearsed speech. Madison's parents are in a difficult situation. Their lease is up next month, and finding appropriate housing at their age, on their budget. We thought this place might be perfect for them, Madison finished. They could help with maintenance, keep an eye on things, and you could transition to something more manageable. I looked at each of them in turn. Gerald with his appraising eyes, Patricia with her practiced smile, Madison with her careful concern, and Ethan, my son, who'd learned to walk on these oak floors, who'd helped me plant those maple trees, who'd brought Caroline wildflowers from the meadow every Mother's Day until he left for college. You want me to give you my house, I said quietly. We want you to consider what's best for everyone, Ethan replied. What's practical? The clock on the mantel ticked into the silence. Outside, a red-winged blackbird landed on the feeder Caroline had hung from the oak tree. It pecked at the seeds I'd refilled that morning, then flew away, leaving the feeder swaying in the October breeze. I appreciate your concern, I said finally. But this is my home. It will remain my home. Dad, Ethan's voice sharpened. Be reasonable. You can't stay here forever. Why not? Because it's not safe. Because it's not practical. Because... He stopped himself, but I saw something flicker across his face. Frustration, impatience, the look of a man whose careful plans were meeting unexpected resistance. Because what? Because sometimes loving someone means helping them make difficult decisions, Madison said softly, even when they don't want to make them. I stood slowly, my joints protesting in the way that reminded me daily of my 72 years. But my voice was steady. I built this house with my own hands, I said. I laid every stone in that foundation. I cut every board, drove every nail. Caroline chose the paint colors, the light fixtures, the fabric for those curtains. We planted that maple grove together the year our son was born. I looked directly at Ethan. This house isn't just wood and nails. It's 42 years of marriage. It's a lifetime of choices made together. Mom's gone, Dad, Ethan said. And for a moment his voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. The words hit like cold water. I felt my chest tighten, not from my heart condition, but from the casual cruelty of a son who could reduce his mother's memory to an inconvenient attachment. "You're right," I said quietly. "She's gone, but her fingerprints are on every surface. Her choices are in every room. Her voice is in the sound this house makes when the wind picks up." I moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Caroline's late roses still bloomed. "You can't understand that because you see this place as square footage and maintenance costs. You've forgotten what a home actually is." "We're trying to help you," Gerald said, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "No," I said, turning back to face them. "You're trying to help yourselves to a house you didn't build, filled with memories you don't share, in a location that suits your needs." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet I'd grown used to. This was the silence of plans derailed, of people who'd expected compliance and found resistance instead. "I think you should go," I said. They exchanged glances, a wordless communication that confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. This hadn't been a casual suggestion. This had been a coordinated effort, carefully planned and unanimously agreed upon. "Dad," Ethan said, standing, "don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything hard," I replied. "I'm making it simple. This is my house. It stays my house." Patricia clutched her purse tighter. Gerald buttoned his coat with sharp, precise movements. Madison's practiced smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "We'll be in touch," Ethan said. "I'm sure you will." I walked them to the door, opened it, and stood aside as they filed out. The October air was sharp and clean, washing away the lingering scent of their expensive perfumes. "Think about what we said," Madison called from the driveway. I didn't answer. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt with a satisfying click. Alone again, I moved through the house Caroline and I had built together. In the kitchen, I poured the cooling second cup of coffee down the drain and washed both mugs, placing them back in their designated spots on the rack. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, its sound echoing through rooms that suddenly felt more like a fortress than a home. I stood in the living room, looking at the indentations in the sofa cushions where my unexpected guests had sat, and realized something fundamental had changed. For 3 years, I'd been Richard the widower, the grieving husband trying to navigate life without his compass. But this morning, I'd become something else. Richard the obstacle, the stubborn old man standing between other people and what they wanted. I walked to Caroline's desk in the corner of the living room, where she'd kept our important papers and neat labeled files. I pulled out the deed to the house, the document that made everything else irrelevant. My name, clearly printed. No liens, no mortgages, no legal obligation to anyone but myself. But as I held the paper in my hands, I understood something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of fear. Legal ownership was just the beginning. They hadn't come here to ask for permission. They'd come to inform me of their decision and give me a chance to cooperate. The boy who'd helped me hang that tire swing in the oak tree, who'd sat in this very room opening Christmas presents, who'd called me his hero until the day he left for college, that boy was gone. In his place was a man who could look his father in the eye and suggest that love meant surrender. I folded the deed carefully and returned it to its file. Through the kitchen window, I could see the maple grove Caroline and I had planted, the trees now tall enough to shade the entire backyard. In the spring, when the leaves unfurled in that tender green that made her catch her breath, she used to say they were growing old gracefully. I wondered if she would say the same about me. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I answered without checking the caller ID. "Dad," Ethan's voice calling from the road. "I wanted you to know we're not giving up on this. We're going to find a way to help you, whether you want us to or not." The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone back in its cradle and stood in my kitchen, surrounded by 42 years of accumulated life. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. The clock ticked its steady rhythm. The house settled around me with the sounds of home. But for the first time since Caroline's funeral, I felt like a stranger in my own life. If you encountered this situation in real life, how would you handle it? Write it in the comments. The first sign that this wasn't just family pressure came on a Thursday morning, 6 days after their visit. I was in the workshop, running my hands along the grain of a piece of walnut I'd been saving for the right project, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in my front door. Not a knock, not the doorbell Caroline had insisted we install because civilized people announce themselves. The metallic click of someone who believed they had the right to enter. I set down the wood and listened. Footsteps in my hallway, voices, Ethan's and another I didn't recognize. A woman's laugh that definitely wasn't Madison's. I walked through the house slowly, my work boots silent on the oak floors I'd installed myself. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see them. Ethan with a clipboard, talking to a middle-aged woman in a navy blazer who was measuring my living room with one of those digital devices real estate agents carry. The crown molding is original, Ethan was saying, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone making a sale. Handcrafted by the previous owner, really adds to the character. Previous owner. As if I were already dead and buried. I stepped into the doorway. "Excuse me." The woman looked up, startled. Ethan's face went through a series of rapid calculations. Surprise, guilt, then something that settled into defensive determination. "Dad," he said, "this is Janet Kowalski from Premium Properties. I thought it would be helpful to get a market assessment." "Market assessment?" I repeated. Janet Kowalski smiled with professional brightness. "Mr. Dalton, your son mentioned you might be considering a transition to a more manageable living situation. I'm just here to provide some preliminary numbers so you can make an informed decision." "I didn't ask for numbers." "No, but—" Ethan stepped forward, his voice taking on that patient tone again. "Dad, you don't have to make any decisions today. We're just gathering information." I looked at the woman with her measuring device, at my son with his clipboard, at the comfortable presumption that had brought them into my house without permission. "Ms. Kowalski," I said quietly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This house is not for sale. It will not be for sale. You can leave now." Her smile faltered. "Oh, I was told—" "You were told wrong." She gathered her things quickly, the kind of retreat that comes from years of reading the room and knowing when to exit. I'll be in touch if anything changes." The front door closed behind her with a soft click. Ethan and I stood in my living room, the space between us suddenly feeling like a chasm. "How did you get in?" I asked. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I still have my key, from when I was a kid." "I didn't give you permission to use it." "Dad, we're family. I was trying to help." "Help by bringing a real estate agent into my house without telling me?" "By exploring options, by being practical." His voice rose slightly. "You can't just bury your head in the sand and pretend nothing's changed." I walked to the kitchen, Ethan following. On the counter sat Caroline's recipe box, the blue ceramic container where she'd kept 40 years of handwritten cards. Pot roast, apple pie, the chocolate chip cookies that had made Ethan's entire Little League team beg for invitations to our house. "You're right," I said. "Things have changed. My son used to respect boundaries." "Your son is trying to look out for you." "My son brought a stranger into my house to put a price on my life." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's just information, Dad. Knowledge is power." "Whose power?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Actually, since I'm here, there's something else we need to discuss." I unfolded the paper. Legal letterhead, formal language, a lot of words that boiled down to a simple concept: transfer of property ownership. My name in the grantor section. Ethan's name as grantee. "What is this?" "A quitclaim deed. Completely voluntary, of course, but it would transfer ownership to me, which would solve a lot of problems." The paper felt heavier than it should have. "What problems?" "Estate planning, tax implications. If something happens to you, Dad, this house goes into probate. Could take years to sort out. This way, everything's clean and simple." "For who?" "For everyone. You'd still live here, of course. Nothing would change day to day. But legally, it would be mine to manage." I set the paper on the counter next to Caroline's recipe box. The contrast was stark, her careful handwriting next to this sterile legal document that would erase 42 years of building a life together. "And if I don't sign?" Ethan shrugged, but there was something forced about the casualness. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." "What bridge?" "Dad, you're 72 years old. You live alone in a house that's too big for one person. You had a heart attack 5 years ago. At some point, decisions are going to be made about your care whether you participate or not." The words hung in the air like smoke. There was the threat, wrapped in concern but unmistakable in its implications. Sign this paper or have decisions made for you. I looked at my son, really looked at him, the boy who'd helped me build the tire swing, the teenager who'd painted the fence one summer for extra spending money, the young man who'd asked me to walk Madison down the aisle because her father had been too drunk to stand upright. When had he learned to speak like this? When had love been replaced by leverage? I need you to leave, I said. Dad, now. He took the paper back, folding it with careful precision. Think about it. Really think about it. This is the best solution for everyone. After he left, I sat at Caroline's desk and opened the drawer where she'd kept her personal correspondence. Letters from her sister in California, thank you notes from the church auxiliary, birthday cards from friends who'd slowly disappeared into their own aging lives. At the bottom of the drawer was a letter she'd written, but never sent, dated 2 months before her diagnosis. The addressee was Ethan. I hesitated, then unfolded it. Caroline's careful script, the handwriting that had filled out permission slips and grocery lists and love notes tucked into my lunchbox. My dear son, it began. I've been watching you lately, and I'm worried about the man you're becoming. Your father built us a life with his hands and his heart, and I fear you see it only as an asset to be managed. Love isn't something you optimize, sweetheart. It's something you tend, like a garden, with patience and daily care. I hope someday you'll understand the difference. She'd never sent it. Maybe she'd changed her mind, or maybe she'd run out of time. But reading it now, I realized Caroline had seen something I'd missed. The signs had been there long before today. That evening, I called my neighbor, Tom Henderson, the only person I trusted with my spare key anymore. Tom, I need you to change my locks. Everything all right, Richard? Just being cautious. I'll be over tomorrow morning. After I hung up, I walked through the house Caroline and I had built together. In the master bedroom, I opened the closet and found the metal box where I kept important documents. Birth certificates, marriage license, Caroline's death certificate, the deed to the house. I added the quitclaim deed to the collection, not because I intended to sign it, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to hold my son's attempt to erase me. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Outside, the maple grove rustled in the evening breeze. The sound Caroline used to say was like the earth breathing. I sat in my reading chair and tried to remember the last time Ethan had visited just to visit, without wanting something, or needing something, or trying to solve some problem I didn't know I had. I couldn't remember. The phone rang at 10:30. Ethan's number on the caller ID. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation today. Have you? I want you to know that everything we're doing comes from love, from wanting what's best for you. Ethan, I said quietly, real love doesn't come with paperwork. Sometimes it does. Sometimes love means making hard choices. You're right, I said. It does. I hung up and unplugged the phone from the wall. The sudden silence was profound, almost sacred. For the first time in 6 days, I felt like I could breathe. But I also understood that this was just the beginning. The real estate agent, the quitclaim deed, the veiled threats about decisions being made for me. These weren't random acts of concern. They were coordinated steps in a plan I was only beginning to understand. My son wasn't just worried about my welfare. He was positioning himself to control it. And tomorrow, I was going to start planning my response. The locksmith finished at 8:30 in the morning, sliding new keys across my kitchen table, with the satisfaction of a man who'd done clean work. Tom Henderson had recommended him, Charlie Novak, a guy who'd been changing locks for 30 years and understood that sometimes privacy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Good solid deadbolts, Charlie said, packing his tools. Nobody's getting through these without making noise. After he left, I tested each lock twice, feeling the smooth click of mechanisms that hadn't been compromised by old keys in the wrong hands. The house felt more like mine again, though I knew locks were just the beginning. I spent the morning in the garage, sorting through boxes I hadn't touched since Caroline's funeral. 3 years of accumulated avoidance, stacked in neat rows that had seemed manageable when I was still numb from loss. Now, with fresh anger sharpening my focus, I needed to see exactly what remained. The first box held Caroline's winter clothes, sweaters she'd knitted herself, the wool coat she'd worn to church every Sunday, scarves and colors that matched her eyes. I folded each piece carefully, breathing in the faint scent of her lavender soap that somehow still clung to the fabric. These would go to the church auxiliary. Caroline would have liked that. The second box was harder. Wedding photos, anniversary cards, the accumulated paperwork of a 47-year marriage. Our honeymoon pictures from Niagara Falls, both of us impossibly young and convinced we had forever. Caroline's medical records from the cancer treatments, neatly organized in manila folders because she'd insisted on staying on top of things, even when those things were killing her. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was the carved wooden box I'd made for her 40th birthday. Inside, every letter I'd ever written her, mostly brief notes left on the kitchen counter when I had early job sites, but she'd saved them all. Gone to the Morrison Project, coffee's made, love you are. 47 years of small declarations preserved like pressed flowers. I closed the box and set it aside. Some things weren't for sorting. The third box held Ethan's childhood artifacts, report cards, art projects, the wooden race car we'd built together for his Cub Scout derby. I found the photo album Caroline had meticulously maintained, Ethan at 2, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, grinning through missing front teeth as he held up the base he'd caught off Henderson's dock. At 16, serious and proud in his baseball uniform, the one season he'd played before, deciding sports weren't his thing. I stopped at a photo from his high school graduation. Ethan in cap and gown, Caroline beaming beside him, me trying not to cry as I took the picture. He'd been accepted to state, full scholarship, the first Dalton to go to college. That night, he'd sat on the front porch with me and Caroline, talking about his plans to study business, maybe come back and help expand my construction company. I want to build something that lasts, he'd said, like what you and Mom built here. When had that changed? When had building something lasting become cashing out something built? I found the answer in a folder near the bottom of the box. Bank statements, loan documents, credit card bills, financial records Ethan had left behind during his last visit. The one after my heart attack when he'd helped me organize my papers. I'd forgotten about them, but now I saw what he'd been dealing with 5 years ago. Massive student loans, despite the scholarship. Credit card debt that had grown like cancer through his 20s. A mortgage on his first house that was underwater when the market crashed. The accumulated weight of trying to maintain a lifestyle his income couldn't support. Caroline had seen it too, I realized. There were notations in her careful handwriting on several of the statements. Paid minimum again. Late fee, 3rd time this year. Called about hardship deferment. She'd been tracking his financial decline like a disease, watching our son drown in debt while pretending everything was fine. I found a letter in her stationery, dated 6 months before her diagnosis. It was addressed to me. Richard, I've been watching Ethan struggle, and I'm afraid he's going to ask us for money again. He's proud, like you, so he'll dress it up as something else. A business opportunity, an investment, a way for us to diversify our assets. But what he really needs is for us to rescue him from choices he can't undo. I love our son, but I've seen what happens when you keep filling a bucket with a hole in the bottom. At some point, you have to let people learn to fix their own holes. We can't save him from himself. We can only save ourselves from being pulled down with him. Don't let guilt make you weak. The house is our security, our legacy, our final gift to each other. Guard it. All my love, Caroline. I read the letter twice, then folded it and slipped it into my wallet. Caroline had understood something I'd been too blind to see. Ethan's sudden concern for my welfare wasn't about love. It was about desperation. The garage felt different now, less like a repository of the past, and more like an arsenal for the future. I found my old file cabinet, the one where I'd kept business records during my contracting years. Client lists, project plans, vendor contacts, the accumulated network of a man who'd built half the houses in 3 counties. I pulled out a folder labeled Marcus Henley, Attorney. Marcus had handled my business contracts for 20 years, kept my company out of 3 frivolous lawsuits, and drawn up our wills after Caroline's diagnosis. If anyone could help me understand the legal implications of Ethan's quit-claim deed, it was Marcus. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was protecting. I spent the afternoon cataloging everything. The house, worth at least $400,000 in today's market, probably more, given the location and the quality of craftsmanship. The savings account Caroline and I had built over 4 decades of living below our means, the pension from my contracting business, the life insurance policy that had paid off the mortgage when Caroline died. All told, I was sitting on close to $700,000 in assets. Not wealthy by Madison's standards, but comfortable enough to fund a retirement or pay off a desperate son's debts. Now I understood the real arithmetic behind their concern for my welfare. The phone rang just after 5. I'd plugged it back in after installing the new locks, but I let it go to the answering machine. "Dad, it's me," Ethan's voice, tighter than usual. "I stopped by earlier, but my key didn't work. I guess you changed the locks. That's fine. But we need to talk. Madison's parents are really struggling, and we need to make some decisions soon. Call me back." I deleted the message without saving it. That evening I sat in Caroline's chair, the one by the window where she used to read, and opened her journal. She'd kept one for 20 years, nothing dramatic or literary, just daily observations about the weather, the garden, small kindnesses from neighbors. I turned to the entries from 3 years ago, the weeks leading up to her diagnosis. March 15th. Ethan called again about the investment opportunity. R said no, but I could see it hurt him. Why is it so hard for children to understand that love doesn't mean bankruptcy? March 2016. Madison mentioned how cramped their apartment is, how nice it would be to have space for her parents to visit. I pretended not to understand the hint. April 3rd. Ethan asked if we'd ever considered downsizing, said he worried about us rattling around in this big house. R just smiled and changed the subject, but I saw the look in Ethan's eyes. He's already spending our money. April 18th. I told R, we need to talk to Marcus about protecting the house. He thinks I'm being dramatic, but I've seen that look before. When people start seeing you as an obstacle instead of a person, it's time to build walls. She'd been preparing for this battle 3 years ago, understanding threats I was only now beginning to recognize. I closed the journal and walked to the window overlooking the maple grove. In the fading light, the trees looked like sentinels, standing guard over ground that had been consecrated by 4 decades of shared labor and love. Tomorrow, I would call Marcus Henley. I would understand my legal options, explore ways to protect what Caroline and I had built together. But tonight, I would simply remember what it felt like to be a man who'd built something lasting with his own hands, in partnership with a woman who'd loved him enough to warn him about the future. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. In the kitchen, I made 1 cup of coffee and sat at the table where Caroline and I had planned our days, our dreams, our defense against a world that always wanted more than we were willing to give. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the gentle complaint of timber that had held strong for 42 years, the whispered promise of foundation stones that would outlast anyone foolish enough to think ownership was just a name on a deed. I was Richard Dalton. I had built this house with my hands and my heart, and I would not be moved from it by anyone, including the son who had forgotten what a home actually was. The battle was just beginning, but I was no longer fighting it alone. Caroline's voice was in every room, her wisdom folded away in my wallet, her warnings finally understood. They wanted my house. They would have to take it from me, and I intended to make that very, very difficult. The call from Marcus Henley came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after I'd left a message on his office voicemail. I was in the kitchen, making coffee the way Caroline had taught me, measured, deliberate, like everything worth doing properly. "Richard, I got your message. We need to talk, and not over the phone." His voice carried the weight of 30 years in law, the kind of gravity that comes from seeing every possible way people can betray each other. "Can you be at my office at 10? Marcus's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Main Street, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence rather than awe. Legal texts lined the walls, their worn spines evidence of regular consultation rather than decoration. He was waiting for me with a pot of coffee and the grim expression of a man who'd spent the weekend researching bad news. "Tell me about the quit-claim deed," he said after we'd settled into chairs that had probably hosted 1,000 difficult conversations. I handed him the document Ethan had presented. Marcus read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. "Richard, if you sign this, you lose everything. The house, the land, all equity. Legally, you'd become a tenant in your own home, dependent on your son's goodwill for shelter. But I'd still live there, until he decides you can't, or until he needs to sell to pay his debts, or until his wife decides she wants to redecorate and you're in the way. Marcus set the paper aside, like it carried disease. This document gives you no protections, no guarantees, no rights. He's my son. He's also a man in serious financial trouble. Marcus opened a folder on his desk. I did some checking. Public records, court filings, business registrations. Your son owes more money than you might realize. The papers Marcus spread across his desk told a story I'd only glimpsed in Ethan's old financial records. Recent court documents showed judgments against him for unpaid credit cards. His business, a consulting firm that existed mostly on paper, had been dormant for 8 months. The mortgage on his house was 3 payments behind. How much? I asked. Conservative estimate, $200,000 in debt minimum. Probably more if you count private loans that don't show up in public records. The number hit me like cold water. $200,000. More than Caroline and I had spent building our entire life together. The quit-claim deed isn't about your welfare, Richard. It's about collateral. He needs assets he can borrow against, and your house is the only thing of value he has access to. I thought about Ethan's visit, the real estate agent with her measuring device, the careful way he'd presented the deed as estate planning rather than desperation. What about the threats, the suggestion that decisions might be made for me? Marcus's expression darkened. Adult guardianship proceedings. If he can convince a judge that you're mentally incompetent or physically unable to care for yourself, he could be appointed as your guardian. Once that happens, he controls everything. Your finances, your medical decisions, where you live. I'm not incompetent. No, but you're 72, recently widowed, and living alone in a large house. To the right judge, presented the right way, that could look like someone who needs protection from himself. The coffee had gone cold in my cup. I stared out the window at Main Street, watching people go about their normal Tuesday morning business, buying groceries, walking dogs, living lives unencumbered by the knowledge that their children might be planning to legally erase them. What can I do? Marcus pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. First, we document everything, every contact, every threat, every attempt at coercion. If he tries to have you declared incompetent, we want a paper trail showing this is about his financial problems, not your mental state. Second, we restructure your assets. Put the house in a trust, name someone else as successor trustee. Make it legally impossible for him to claim ownership or force a sale. And third, Marcus looked up from his notes. You prepare for this to get ugly, because when desperate people realize their first plan won't work, they usually escalate to their second plan, and their second plan is rarely prettier than their first. I left Marcus's office with a briefcase full of documents to review and sign. Trust agreements, power of attorney forms, medical directives, the legal armor of a man preparing for siege. But as I walked back to my truck, I realized paperwork was only part of the solution. Ethan had shown he was willing to enter my house without permission, to bring strangers into my private space, to threaten guardianship proceedings if I didn't cooperate. Legal protections were necessary, but they were also reactive. I needed something more immediate, more personal. I needed to know what he was planning next. That afternoon, I drove past Ethan's house, a modest colonial in a subdivision that had seemed impressive 15 years ago, but now looked tired around the edges. The lawn needed cutting, and there was a real estate flyer in the mailbox, not advertising the house for sale, but probably one of those "we buy houses fast for cash" solicitations that desperate people sometimes answer. Madison's car was in the driveway, along with another vehicle I recognized from their visit to my house. Gerald and Patricia Monroe's silver sedan, the one with the coexist bumper sticker that somehow made their attempt to evict me even more infuriating. I parked 3 houses down and waited. 20 minutes later, the front door opened and the 4 of them emerged, walking with the purposeful stride of people who'd just made important decisions. They stood in a circle on the driveway, voices too low for me to hear, but body language unmistakable. This was a war council. Gerald pointed in the direction of my house. Patricia nodded emphatically. Madison gestured with her hands in a way that suggested she was describing floor plans, room layouts, possibilities. Ethan listened with his arms crossed, his face set in the expression he'd worn as a teenager when he was planning something he knew I wouldn't approve of. They talked for 10 more minutes before getting into their cars. Gerald and Patricia left first, followed by Madison. Ethan stood in his driveway for a long moment, staring in the direction they had pointed, toward my house, my life, my refuge from a world that had become suddenly hostile. I waited until he went inside, then drove home through streets that had once felt familiar and safe. Now every intersection seemed like a checkpoint, every neighbor a potential witness to whatever came next. That evening, I called the one person I trusted to give me perspective without judgment. Helen Morrison had been Caroline's best friend for 30 years, a woman who'd seen our family through celebrations and crises, who'd held my wife's hand during chemotherapy and my hand at the funeral. "Richard," she said when she heard my voice, "how are you holding up?" I told her everything: the visit, the real estate agent, the quitclaim deed, the legal consultation with Marcus. Helen listened without interrupting, the way Caroline used to when I needed to work through a problem out loud. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished, "Caroline saw this coming." "What do you mean?" "The last time we had lunch, maybe 6 months before she got sick, she said something that worried me. She said, Ethan looked at your house the way some people look at lottery tickets, like it was the solution to problems he wouldn't admit he had. She never told me that. She didn't want to worry you, but she made me promise to keep an eye on things after she was gone. Said she was afraid Ethan would see your grief as opportunity." The words hit like a punch to the chest. Caroline had understood the threat better than I had tried to protect me even from beyond the grave through the wisdom of a friend who'd promised to watch over me. Helen, what would she do? If she were here, facing this, what would Caroline tell me to do? There was a long pause. When Helen spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone channeling decades of friendship. She'd tell you to fight, not with anger, but with intelligence. Caroline never backed down from anything worth protecting, and that house is everything worth protecting. Your memories, your independence, your right to live on your own terms. She'd also tell you to be smart about it, document everything, trust the right people, and don't let anyone make you feel guilty for refusing to be a victim. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair by the window and watched the maple grove settle into darkness. The trees she'd chosen, planted with her own hands, now mature enough to frame the view exactly as she'd envisioned 40 years ago. Tomorrow, I would sign the trust documents Marcus had prepared. I would begin the legal process of making my house untouchable, beyond the reach of desperate sons and enabling in-laws. But tonight, I would simply remember what it felt like to be part of a partnership that had created something lasting. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. The sound Caroline had always said reminded her that the world was bigger than our problems. But our problems had a way of making the world feel very small indeed. I was going to need more than legal documents to protect what mattered. I was going to need a plan that anticipated Ethan's next move, because Helen was right. Caroline had seen this coming, and she'd spent her final months trying to prepare me for a battle I'd been too naive to understand. The war wasn't just beginning. It had been quietly raging for years, and I was finally ready to start fighting back. The first thing I did wrong was underestimate how quickly desperate people move when they sense resistance. The second thing I did wrong was assume that family meant something to people who'd already decided you were an obstacle rather than a person. I learned both lessons on a Friday morning when I came home from the hardware store to find Ethan's truck in my driveway and my front door standing open. Not broken open. That would have been honest. Simply open, as if he belonged there, as if the new locks were merely suggestions rather than boundaries. I could hear voices from inside, Ethan's, Madison's, and another I didn't recognize. A man's voice, professional and measured, asking questions about square footage and property lines. I parked behind Ethan's truck, blocking him in, and walked through my own front door like a visitor in my own life. "Dad!" Ethan's voice carried forced brightness, the tone of someone who'd been caught but refused to admit wrongdoing. "There you are. We were just getting another market assessment," I finished, looking at the stranger with a tape measure who'd been documenting my living room. "Without permission, again." The man looked uncomfortable. "I was told you'd authorize this evaluation." "You were told wrong." I turned to Ethan. "How did you get in?" "The back door was unlocked." It wasn't true, and we both knew it. I'd checked every lock that morning, tested every window, followed the security routine I'd developed since changing the locks. But calling him a liar would escalate this into something louder than I wanted it to be. "I'll need you all to leave," I said quietly. The appraiser gathered his equipment quickly, the kind of retreat that comes from recognizing domestic disputes that aren't his problem. Madison followed him out with an expression of practiced victimhood, as if my refusal to cooperate was a personal attack rather than a property owner's basic right. Ethan lingered, studying me with calculating eyes. "Dad, this resistance isn't helping anyone. We're trying to plan for your future." "My future is my business." "Not if you can't manage it yourself." His voice carried a new edge, sharper than before. "People are starting to talk about the old man living alone in that big house, maybe not taking care of himself the way he should." "What people?" "Dr. Morrison, for one. He mentioned you missed your last appointment." I had missed it, but only because I'd been meeting with Marcus about the trust documents, a scheduling conflict, nothing more. But Ethan's tone suggested he saw it as evidence of decline rather than simple logistics. "And Tom Henderson mentioned you've been acting paranoid lately, changing locks, asking questions about property records." Tom Henderson, who changed my locks as a favor, who I'd trusted with my spare key for 15 years, now apparently reporting my business to my son, like I was a wayward teenager rather than a grown man protecting his privacy. "Paranoid," I repeated. "Dad, when you start seeing threats where there aren't any, when you become suspicious of people who are trying to help you, that's a sign. A sign that maybe you need more support than you're willing to admit." The words were carefully chosen, the kind of language that would sound reasonable to a judge evaluating competency. Ethan wasn't just threatening guardianship proceedings, he was building a case for them, one concerned observation at a time. "Get out of my house," I said. "Dad, now." After he left, I walked through every room, checking for what might have been moved, photographed, or documented during their uninvited visit. Everything looked normal, but normal was no longer enough. They'd been in my house twice now without permission, treating my privacy like an inconvenience rather than a right. I called Marcus immediately. "They're escalating," I told him, building a case for incompetency by documenting every missed appointment, every security precaution, every act of self-protection as evidence of paranoia. "We expected this," Marcus said. "The good news is that they're moving too fast, being too obvious about their motives. Judges don't like adult children who seem more interested in assets than welfare." "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that perception matters. If they can create a narrative of decline, supported by enough witnesses, even baseless accusations become harder to defend against." "So what do? "We accelerate our timeline. Get the trust finalized this week, not next month. Document every intrusion, every threat, every attempt at manipulation. And Richard, consider installing a security system. If they're willing to enter your house without permission, we need evidence of that behavior." That afternoon, I drove to the electronics store and bought the most comprehensive security system I could afford. Cameras for every entrance, motion sensors for the main rooms, a control panel that would alert me to any unauthorized entry. The young man who sold it to me explained the features with enthusiasm, probably thinking he was helping an elderly man feel safer in his home. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. The installation took me most of Saturday, running cables, mounting cameras, testing connections, work that reminded me of the satisfaction that comes from building something functional with your own hands. Each camera positioned to capture evidence, each sensor calibrated to detect intrusion. By Sunday morning, my house had become a fortress, not to keep the world out, but to document what happened when certain people tried to force their way in. I tested the system by walking through my own front door. The camera captured my image clearly, the motion sensor triggered immediately, and the control panel logged the entry with precise timestamps. If Ethan wanted to build a case based on my behavior, I would build a counter case based on his. The first real test came Monday evening. I was in the kitchen, heating leftover soup, when the motion sensor chimed and my phone buzzed with an alert. Front door camera, a figure in dark clothing, testing the door handle, then moving to peer through the front window. I watched on my phone screen as the figure circled the house, checking windows, trying the back door, spending several minutes examining the garage entrance. male, medium height, moving with familiarity rather than caution. Not a burglar. Burglars don't spend 10 minutes casing a house in broad daylight. When the figure stepped into the light from the back porch, I saw his face clearly. Ethan conducting what looked like a security assessment of his own, learning my new routines, mapping my defenses. I didn't confront him. Instead, I saved the video and sent a copy to Marcus. Evidence was more valuable than confrontation. The next morning, my phone rang at 6:30. An unknown number, but I answered anyway. Mr. Dalton, this is Sarah Chen from Adult Protective Services. We've received some concerns about your welfare, and I'd like to schedule a visit to conduct a wellness check. The words hit like ice water. What concerns? Reports that you may be experiencing some confusion, possibly neglecting self-care. The caller seemed quite worried about your safety. Who called? I'm not able to share that information, but I want you to know this is routine. We just want to make sure you're doing well and have the support you need. I scheduled the visit for Thursday afternoon, then called Marcus immediately. They're playing hardball now, he said. Adult Protective Services, wellness checks. These are the preliminary steps in a guardianship case. They're trying to create an official record of concern before filing any legal action. What should I expect? Questions about your daily routine, your medical care, your social support network. They'll look for signs of self-neglect, confusion, isolation. The good news is that you're obviously competent in caring for yourself well. But Richard, this means they're serious. This isn't just about getting your house anymore. They're trying to get control of your entire life. That afternoon, I drove to Helen Morrison's house. She was in her garden, tending the roses she and Caroline had planned together 20 years ago. When she saw my face, she set down her pruning shears and led me to the porch swing where she and Caroline had spent countless afternoons solving the world's problems. They called Adult Protective Services, I told her. Helen's face hardened. Those bastards! I'd never heard Helen swear before. It was oddly comforting. What can I do? You can fight. You can document everything. And you can remember that Caroline didn't raise a man who backs down from bullies just because they happen to share his DNA. That evening, I sat at Caroline's desk and wrote down everything I could remember about the past 2 weeks. Every visit, every threat, every intrusion. The timeline of a family relationship dissolving into something that looked more like predation than love. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. Outside, the maple grove rustled in the evening breeze, the sound Caroline had called the earth's lullaby. But I wasn't sleepy. I was angry, focused, and finally ready to stop defending and start attacking. Thursday would bring the wellness check. The official scrutiny of a life they were trying to portray as diminished. But I had video evidence of unauthorized entry, financial records showing their desperation, and the accumulated wisdom of a woman who'd seen this coming and prepared me to fight. Let them come. Let them document and evaluate and judge. I would show them what a competent man looked like when he'd finally stopped pretending that love meant surrender. The battle was escalating, but so was my resolve. Caroline's voice was in every room, her wisdom folded in my wallet, her warnings finally fully understood. They wanted to take everything from me, but I was no longer the grieving widower they thought they could manipulate. I was a man defending his home, his dignity, and his right to live free from the parasitic concern of people who confused assets with affection. And I was just getting started. The Adult Protective Services visit went exactly as I expected, which is to say, it revealed more about the people who'd called them than about any deficiencies in my care. Sarah Chen was a professional woman in her 40s, the kind who'd probably spent years distinguishing between genuine neglect and family power, plays disguised as concern. She spent an hour walking through my house, asking questions about my daily routine, examining my refrigerator, my medicine cabinet, my personal hygiene. I showed her my security system, explained my exercise routine, demonstrated that I could cook, clean, and manage my finances without assistance. Mr. Dalton, she said as she prepared to leave, I want you to know that I see no evidence of self-neglect or diminished capacity. Whoever called us was either misinformed or, she paused diplomatically, operating from incomplete information. What happens next? I'll file a report stating that no protective services are needed. The case will be closed unless new, credible concerns arise. After she left, I called Marcus with the good news, but he sounded troubled rather than relieved. Richard, this is both better and worse than I expected. Better because you've been officially evaluated as competent and self-sufficient. Worse because it means they're running out of legal options, which makes them more likely to try illegal ones, such as forced entry, manipulation of medical records, manufactured emergencies. When people are desperate enough to involve state agencies in family disputes, they're usually desperate enough to escalate further when those agencies don't cooperate. That evening, I reviewed the security footage from the past week. Multiple visits from Ethan, always alone, always after dark. He'd tested every window, every door, even examined the electrical box and water meter. This wasn't casual concern. This was reconnaissance. I was reviewing the latest footage when my phone rang. Ethan's number. Dad, we need to talk, face to face, tonight. It's 8:30. This can't wait. I'm coming over. No, you're not. Dad, there are things you don't understand. Financial pressures, legal complications. If we don't act soon, you could lose everything. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sinister. I could lose everything to who? To creditors, to the state, to people who don't care about family the way we do. I'm not losing anything to anyone, Ethan, especially not to family members who care so much they call government agencies to have me declared incompetent. Silence, then. You know about that? I know about everything. The real estate assessments, the quitclaim deed, the wellness check. I know you've been circling my house like a vulture waiting for something to die. Dad, you don't understand? I understand perfectly. You owe money you can't pay, and you see my house as the solution to your problems. What I don't understand is how the boy I raised became the kind of man who would destroy his father to save himself. I'm not destroying anything. I'm trying to help you before it's too late. Too late for what? Before the bank forecloses on the house next month. The words hit like a physical blow. What bank? The one that holds the second mortgage you don't know about. The one Madison's father co-signed for when we needed money for his medical bills last year. I felt the room tilt. There is no second mortgage on my house. There is now, $40,000, payments due quarterly. The next payment is next week, and if we can't make it, they start foreclosure proceedings. The phone felt heavy in my hand. That's impossible. I own this house free and clear. You owned it free and clear until we needed emergency funds and had to use it as collateral. Dad, I tried to handle this myself, but the interest rate is killing us. The only way out is to sell the house and use the proceeds to pay off the loan. You can't mortgage a house you don't own. Actually, you can, if you have power of attorney for medical decisions and the owner is deemed temporarily incapacitated due to cardiac events. The words came together like pieces of a puzzle I should have seen forming. My heart attack 5 years ago. The period of recovery when I'd been too weak to handle paperwork. The forms Ethan had brought to the hospital for me to sign. Documents I'd trusted him to handle while I focused on healing. You forged my signature. I protected your interests when you couldn't. And now I'm trying to protect them again. By stealing my house. By saving it. Dad, if you don't cooperate, we lose everything. The foreclosure will happen whether you want it or not. At least this way, we can control the outcome. I hung up and immediately called Marcus, even though it was after 9 o'clock. Emergency, I said when he answered. Can someone mortgage my house without my knowledge? Under very specific circumstances, yes. If they had power of attorney and could demonstrate necessity during a period of incapacity. Richard, what's happened? I explained Ethan's call, the claims about emergency medical bills and quarterly payments. Marcus listened with the grim silence of a man who'd seen every possible way families could betray each other. We need to verify this immediately. If there's a legitimate mortgage, it should show up in public records. If there isn't, then he's either lying to manipulate you or he's committed fraud. Either way, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Can you check tonight? I can access the county database from home. Give me an hour. The longest hour of my life. I sat in Caroline's chair, staring out at the maple grove that had framed our view for 40 years, wondering if I was about to lose everything we'd built together to the desperation of a son who'd learned to weaponize love. Marcus called back at 10:15. Richard, there's no second mortgage on your property, no liens, no outstanding loans, nothing that would give anyone the right to foreclose. Your house is exactly what you thought it was, owned free and clear. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by cold fury. So, he was lying, completely. But Richard, this tells us something important. He's not just desperate, he's willing to commit fraud, forgery, and extortion to get what he wants. This has moved beyond family dispute into criminal territory. What do? Document everything, record any future conversations if possible, and consider whether you want to file criminal charges for the unauthorized entry, attempted fraud, and harassment. Criminal charges against my own son. Criminal charges against a man who's trying to steal your home and destroy your life. The fact that you shared DNA doesn't give him immunity from the law. After we hung up, I sat in the dark house Caroline and I had built together, processing the magnitude of my son's betrayal. Not just the attempted theft, but the calculated cruelty of making me believe I might lose everything to forces beyond my control. Tomorrow, I would file a police report. I would document every lie, every intrusion, every attempt at manipulation. But tonight, I would plan something else, a response that would end this once and for all. Ethan had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I was the same trusting father who'd signed hospital paperwork without reading it, who'd given him keys and expected respect in return. He'd forgotten that I'd spent 40 years building things to last, solving problems that couldn't be fixed with wishful thinking. I opened Caroline's desk and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. At the top, I wrote, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement, Dalton Family Home." If he wanted to play legal games, I would show him what real legal protection looked like. If he wanted to involve fraudulent mortgages and forged documents, I would create paperwork that would make his schemes irrelevant. And if he thought he could intimidate an old man into surrender, I would demonstrate exactly what 40 years of marriage to Caroline Morrison had taught me about fighting for what mattered. The battle was about to become a war, but this time I would be firing the first shot. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times. Outside, the wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the driveway where Ethan's truck had sat that morning, where he'd stood, planning my displacement like a general studying terrain. Let him plan. Let him scheme. Let him involve banks and lawyers and government agencies. I was about to make all of his plans irrelevant. And unlike him, I was going to do it legally. The irrevocable trust was signed and notarized by 10 o'clock Tuesday morning. Marcus had worked through the weekend to prepare the documents, understanding that timing was everything when dealing with people desperate enough to forge mortgages and file false welfare reports. "It's done," he said, sliding the final papers across his desk. "As of this moment, the Richard and Caroline Dalton Memorial Trust owns your house. You remain as lifetime beneficiary with full occupancy rights, but legally, the property can never be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the consent of all three trustees. And the trustees are? You, me, and Helen Morrison. If anything happens to you, Helen and I make all decisions about the property. Your son has no legal standing whatsoever." I held the documents that made my house untouchable, bulletproof against any scheme Ethan might devise. But paperwork was only half the solution. The other half required something more personal. "Marcus, I want to call a family meeting, tonight. Neutral ground, your conference room, if you'll allow it." "Richard, are you sure that's wise, given their behavior lately?" "I'm sure it's necessary. This ends tonight, one way or another." The calls were brief and to the point. Ethan first, then Madison, then Gerald and Patricia Monroe. "Family meeting, 7 o'clock, Marcus Henley's office. We're going to settle this once and for all." I spent the afternoon in my workshop, not building anything, just touching the tools that had shaped my life. The hand plane Caroline bought me for our 20th anniversary. The level that had helped me true every wall in our house. The measuring tape that knew the dimensions of everything we'd built together. At 6:30, I drove to Marcus's office. He was waiting in the conference room with coffee and the satisfied expression of a man who'd spent his career watching justice prevail over manipulation. "You ready for this?" he asked. "I've been ready for 3 weeks." They arrived together, Ethan and Madison in their black SUV, Gerald and Patricia following in their silver sedan. A delegation once again, but this time walking into my territory rather than invading theirs. The The conference room was elegant in the way that inspires respect for process and law. Mahogany table, leather chairs, walls lined with legal texts that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about human nature and its capacity for both creation and destruction. They took seats on one side of the table, facing Marcus and me like opposing counsel in a trial, which, in many ways, was exactly what this was. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I called this meeting because we need to discuss the future of my house, my finances, and my relationship with my family." Ethan leaned forward, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Dad, I'm glad you're finally ready to be reasonable about this." "Oh, I'm being very reasonable, but probably not in the way you expect." I nodded to Marcus, who opened a folder and began reading from prepared notes. First, regarding the alleged second mortgage that Mr. Ethan Dalton claims exists on his father's property. Our investigation shows no such mortgage has ever been filed, recorded, or legitimately executed. Any claims to the contrary constitute attempted fraud. Ethan's face went pale. "Dad, I can explain." "Second," Marcus continued, regarding the Adult Protective Services report filed against Mr. Richard Dalton. Our investigation shows this report was filed by a family member making false claims about his competency and self-care abilities. The investigating social worker found no evidence supporting these claims. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Gerald studied his hands. "Third, regarding unauthorized entry to Mr. Dalton's residence. We have video evidence of multiple intrusions by family members, including attempts to jimmy locks and examine security measures." "Now, wait a minute," Gerald began, but Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not finished. Fourth, regarding the quitclaim deed presented to Mr. Dalton. This document, if signed, would have transferred ownership of his primary residence for no consideration, effectively disinheriting him from his own property. Under normal circumstances, this would constitute elder abuse." The room had gone very quiet. Madison's practiced composure was cracking. Ethan looked like a man watching his life's plan crumble in real time. "However," Marcus said, closing the folder, "Mr. Dalton has chosen not to pursue criminal charges at this time. Instead, he has a proposal." I stood, walking to the window that overlooked Main Street. Outside, the town Caroline and I had called home for 42 years went about its evening business. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the kind of betrayal that could turn a family gathering into a legal proceeding. "Ethan," I said without turning around, "you're in debt, serious debt, the kind that makes people do desperate things. I understand desperation. I've felt it myself when Caroline was sick and the insurance company tried to deny her treatment." "Dad, but I never looked at another person's life and decided it was mine to take. I never convinced myself that love meant theft or that family obligation meant surrender." I turned back to face them. "You've spent 3 weeks trying to take my house through manipulation, fraud, and intimidation. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what's actually going to happen." The silence stretched until I could hear the hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. "The house has been placed in an irrevocable trust. I remain the lifetime beneficiary, but it can never be sold, mortgaged, or transferred to pay anyone's debts. When I die, it becomes the property of the County Historical Society, preserved as an example of mid-century craftsmanship." "You can't do that," Madison said, her voice sharp with panic. "I already have." I placed a copy of the trust documents on the table. "It's done, recorded, and legally bulletproof." Ethan stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "Dad, you don't understand. Without this house, we'll lose everything." "You've already lost everything that mattered," I said quietly. "You lost it the moment you decided your father was an obstacle instead of a person." "This is insane," Gerald said, standing abruptly. "You're destroying your own family out of spite. I'm protecting myself from people who would destroy me out of greed." Patricia clutched her purse tighter. "Richard, we can work something out. Alone, perhaps, or—" "The meeting is over," I said. "Marcus will provide you with copies of all relevant documents. Any future contact should go through his office." They filed out like mourners leaving a funeral, which in many ways they were. The death of a relationship. The burial of whatever trust had once existed between us. Marcus and I sat in the quiet conference room, processing what had just happened. "How do you feel?" he asked, like a man who just amputated a limb to save his life. "Any regrets?" I thought about Caroline, about the boy Ethan used to be, about the grandchildren who would never know their grandfather because their parents had chosen greed over relationship. "Ask me in a year," I said. The drive home took me past Ethan's house. The lights were on, and I could see figures moving behind the curtains, probably processing their failure, planning their next move, or maybe just coming to terms with the fact that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. I pulled into my own driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house Caroline and I had built together. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the front porch where we'd shared coffee and planned our days. But it felt different now. Not just protected, but purified. Cleansed of the contamination that comes when love is treated as leverage and family becomes a form of warfare. Inside, I walked through rooms that were finally, completely mine again. In the kitchen, I made 1 cup of coffee and sat at the table where Caroline and I had shared 47 years of morning conversations. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking another day survived, another battle won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ethan wouldn't simply accept defeat. Desperate people rarely do. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had chosen together, protected by laws that recognized the difference between family and predation. I raised my coffee cup to the empty kitchen, to endings that felt like beginnings, to the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally stopped confusing love with surrender. "It's ours," I whispered to Caroline's memory. "Still and always ours." The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the gentle conversation of timber and stone that had sheltered us through 4 decades of marriage and would shelter me through whatever years remained. Not empty now, but complete. Not lonely, but free. The war was over, and for the first time in months, I slept peacefully in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by my own choices and the accumulated wisdom of a woman who taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter who tries to take them away. 6 months later, I woke to the sound of spring rain tapping against the bedroom windows, the same gentle percussion that had lulled Caroline and me to sleep for 42 years. The maple grove was beginning to leaf out, and that tender green she'd always said looked like hope made visible. I made coffee the way she'd taught me, measured and deliberate, and sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper. The ritual had become meditation, a daily acknowledgement that some routines outlive the people who make them sacred. The phone rang as I was reading the sports section, something that still surprised me, given how rarely it rang anymore. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Mr. Dalton, this is Sarah Chen from Adult Protective Services. I hope you remember me." I remember. How could I forget the woman who'd walked through my house looking for evidence of decline, and found instead a man perfectly capable of caring for himself? "I'm calling because we received another report about your welfare. Same concerns as before. Isolation, possible neglect, family worried about your safety." I set down the paper. "Same caller? I can't share that information. But I want you to know that, given my previous assessment and the time that's passed, I'm not recommending a follow-up visit, unless you feel you need one. I don't. I didn't think so, but, Mr. Dalton, whoever is making these calls seems quite persistent. You might want to document this pattern of harassment." After she hung up, I called Marcus. He wasn't surprised. "They're testing the boundaries," he said, "seeing if persistence might accomplish what legal action couldn't. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected." And it was true. The first month after the trust was finalized had been difficult. Not because I regretted my decision, but because grief has many forms, and losing a child to their own choices carries its own particular weight. But as winter gave way to spring, something had shifted. The house no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like home again. I had started volunteering at the County Historical Society, sharing my knowledge of local construction techniques with people who understood that preservation meant more than just maintaining buildings. It meant maintaining the stories they contained. Twice a week, I led tours of historic homes, explaining joinery methods and foundation techniques to visitors who appreciated craftsmanship that had outlasted its creators. Helen Morrison had become a regular presence, stopping by for coffee and conversation the way she used to do when Caroline was alive. We talked about books, about the town's changes, about anything except the family drama that had consumed my winter. She understood that healing required moving forward, not endlessly relitigating the past. "You're looking better," she said one afternoon, as we sat on the front porch, watching the maple buds swell with approaching leaf out. "More like yourself." "I feel more like myself. For a while there, I wasn't sure who that was anymore." Caroline knew. She always said you were stronger than you realized, more capable of standing alone than you wanted to admit. The mention of Caroline no longer came with the sharp edge of fresh grief. 3.5 years had softened the pain into something more manageable, not absence, but presence in a different form. I could feel her in the garden, where her roses were beginning their annual resurrection, in the rooms where her choices still shaped daily life, in the steady rhythm of seasons that continued to change with or without human witness. That evening, I was in the workshop, sanding a piece of cherry wood that would become a jewelry box for Helen's granddaughter, when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel in the driveway. The security system chimed, and I checked my phone screen expecting to see a delivery truck, or perhaps Helen returning for something she'd forgotten. Instead, I saw a figure I hadn't expected. Ethan, standing beside his truck, hands in his pockets, staring at the house with an expression I couldn't read from the camera angle. I watched him for several minutes. He didn't approach the door or try the windows. He simply stood there, perhaps processing the changes that 6 months had brought to both of us. His truck looked older, more worn. His clothes were casual rather than the business attire I'd grown accustomed to seeing. He'd lost weight, and something about his posture suggested a man who'd learned hard lessons about the difference between wanting and deserving. Finally, he walked to the front door and knocked, not the demanding rap of someone who expected entry, but the hesitant tap of someone asking permission. I turned off the workshop lights and walked through the house slowly, giving myself time to decide how I wanted to handle this. The man at my door was my son, but he was also the person who'd tried to steal my home, forge my documents, and have me declared incompetent. Forgiveness and wisdom didn't always point in the same direction. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Dad?" His voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of the confident manipulation that had characterized our winter conversations. "Ethan, I know I don't have the right to be here. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to tell you something." I waited. The evening air was soft and carried the scent of Caroline's lilacs, just beginning to bloom. I was wrong about everything, the house, the pressure, the lies I told myself about helping you. He swallowed hard. "I convinced myself that what I was doing was for your own good, but the truth is, I was drowning, and I thought your house was a life preserver I could grab. And now I'm still drowning, but I understand that pulling you under with me wasn't love. It was selfishness dressed up as concern." I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse, the kind that comes from hitting bottom hard enough to crack open whatever hard shell had formed around his conscience. "What changed?" I asked. "Madison left me. Her parents moved to Florida. The house went into foreclosure last month." He managed a bitter smile. "Turns out that when your schemes fail, the people who encourage them disappear pretty quickly." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Not sorry that his manipulations had failed, but sorry that his life had become something that required manipulation to sustain. "Are you? Really?" "I'm sorry that my son became someone I didn't recognize. I'm sorry that you learned to see family as a resource to be exploited, rather than people to be loved. I'm sorry that you lost your way so completely that you thought destroying your father was an acceptable path to salvation." Ethan flinched as if each word carried physical weight. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I burned bridges that can't be rebuilt, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you, what I almost took away." "What was that?" "Your dignity, your autonomy, your right to live your life on your own terms." His voice cracked slightly. "Your right to grieve Mom in your own way, in your own space, without someone trying to monetize your memories." We stood in the gathering dusk, father and son separated by a threshold that had become more than just architectural. The distance between us measured not in feet, but in trust destroyed, respect abandoned, love weaponized beyond easy repair. "I don't expect anything from you," Ethan continued. "I don't expect forgiveness or reconciliation or another chance. I just wanted you to know that I see clearly now what I couldn't see before, that you were never the problem. I was. A year ago, even 6 months ago, those words might have cracked something open in my chest, might have prompted the kind of tearful reunion that movies prefer to the messier reality of genuine betrayal. But too much had happened. Too much trust had been destroyed. Too many lies had been told for simple apologies to bridge the gap between us. I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully, "but acknowledgement isn't the same as repair. I know it might be too late for repair. It might be." He nodded, accepting the weight of that possibility. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Are you happy, living here alone, I mean? Are you content?" I considered the question seriously. Was I happy? Contentment and happiness weren't the same thing, and both were different from the deep satisfaction of a life lived according to your own values, rather than other people's expectations. "I'm peaceful," I said finally. "I'm free. I'm surrounded by 42 years of memories that no one can take away or monetize or turn into something other than what they were. I wake up in a house I built with my own hands, drink coffee from a cup my wife chose, and make decisions based on what I want rather than what other people need from me. That sounds lonely. Sometimes it is, but loneliness is different from being alone. I'm alone by choice now, not because I'm too trusting or too naive or too willing to let other people define my life for me." Ethan stood there for another moment, perhaps hoping for an invitation inside, a cup of coffee, a chance to sit in the living room where he'd played as a child, and try to find some thread of connection that might survive the wreckage of the past year. But some doors, once closed, require more than apologies to reopen. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend itself just because the person who broke it has finally acknowledged the damage. "I should go," he said finally. "Yes, you should. Dad, if anything changes, if you ever want to talk or if you need anything, I have Marcus's number if I need legal help. I have Helen if I need friendship. I have the Historical Society if I need purpose. What I need, I have." He nodded, understanding the geography of the relationship we'd be left with. Not estrangement exactly, but distance carefully maintained, boundaries clearly marked. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing around the curve where the road entered the pine woods Caroline and I had walked through countless times. Then I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, not in anger, but in acknowledgement that some chapters end not with reconciliation, but with clarity. In the kitchen, I made evening tea and sat at the table where Caroline and I had planned our days, our dreams, our responses to whatever challenges life presented. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day completed, another small victory in the ongoing project of living according to my own values rather than other people's needs. Outside, the spring evening settled over the maple grove, over the garden where Caroline's choices still bloomed every year, over the foundation stones that would outlast anyone foolish enough to think ownership was just a name on a deed. I was Richard Dalton. I had built this house with my hands and my heart, preserved it with wisdom and legal protections, and defended it against people who confused love with leverage. I would live here on my own terms, die here when my time came, and leave it to people who understood that some things are worth preserving, not for their monetary value, but for the stories they contain. The battle was over, the war was won, and in the quiet that followed victory, I discovered something I hadn't expected, that peace wasn't just the absence of conflict, but the presence of choices freely made, boundaries clearly set, and a life lived according to principles that couldn't be bought, sold, or manipulated away. The house breathed around me with its familiar sounds. Somewhere in the distance, spring peepers began their evening chorus. The earth was turning toward summer, toward growth, toward the eternal renewal that continues regardless of human drama. I finished my tea, checked the locks, and prepared for sleep in the bedroom where Caroline and I had shared 42 years of dreams. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and possibilities, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in a home that was mine, not because my name was on a deed, but because every board and stone and carefully chosen detail reflected choices made in partnership with someone who would love me enough to warn me about the future and trust me enough to fight for it when the time came. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times. In the maple grove, night sounds settled into their eternal rhythm. And in the house that Caroline and I built together, a man who'd learned the difference between family and exploitation slept peacefully, surrounded by memories that couldn't be stolen and choices that couldn't be undone. It was enough. It was home. It was his. 2 years after that evening visit from Ethan, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a small house with a modest front porch, flower boxes under the windows, and a man I barely recognized working in the garden. The man was Ethan, but thinner, wearing work clothes instead of a business suit, his hands dirty with honest soil. On the back of the photo, in handwriting that had grown less confident but more genuine, he'd written, "Learning to build instead of take. Thank you for the lesson." I studied the photo for a long time, then placed it in Caroline's recipe box alongside the cards that documented 40 years of family meals. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that people could change, that sometimes the hardest lessons produce the most authentic growth. Helen found me there when she arrived for our weekly coffee, still holding the photograph. "Good news?" she asked. "Complicated news. The best kind, maybe." We sat on the front porch as we did every Tuesday, watching the world go about its business. The maple grove was in full summer leaf now, providing the shade Caroline had envisioned when we'd planted those saplings 43 years ago. Her garden bloomed in carefully planned succession, early roses giving way to summer perennials, each season building on the choices she'd made with an eye toward the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Helen asked. "Standing your ground the way you did?" I considered the question while watching a red-winged blackbird build its nest in the oak tree where Caroline's bird feeder still hung. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that it was done. Caroline would be proud of you. Caroline would be satisfied that her warnings weren't wasted. She saw what was coming long before I did." That afternoon, I walked through the house that had become more than shelter, more than just a collection of rooms where two people had shared a life. It had become a statement about the value of building something to last, about the importance of protecting what matters, about the difference between love and exploitation. In Caroline's sewing room, her quilts still waited on the cutting table. I'd never moved them, understanding finally that some projects are meant to remain unfinished, testament to lives interrupted, rather than lives incomplete. In the kitchen, her recipe box held the accumulated wisdom of a woman who'd understood that feeding people was an act of love, that hospitality was a choice rather than an obligation. The workshop smelled of wood shavings, and the satisfaction that comes from creating something functional with your own hands. I'd been building birdhouses lately, simple structures that would outlast their builders and provide shelter for creatures that understood instinctively what humans often forgot, that home wasn't about size or status, but about safety and belonging. As evening approached, I sat in Caroline's chair by the window and opened the last letter she'd written, not to Ethan, but to me, found tucked inside her favorite cookbook months after the trust was finalized. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, it means you found your way through whatever storm came after I left you. I hope it wasn't too terrible, but I suspect it was necessary. I spent our marriage watching you build things that lasted, houses that sheltered families for generations, furniture that grew more beautiful with age, relationships that deepened rather than wore thin over time. But I worried that you'd never learn to protect what you built from people who would tear it down for their own purposes. The house isn't just wood and stone, my love. It's the physical embodiment of every choice we made together, every sacrifice that brought us joy. Every morning, we woke up grateful to be exactly where we were. Guard it not because it's valuable, but because it's irreplaceable, and guard yourself the same way. You're worth more than what you can provide to other people. You deserve to live your final years surrounded by love rather than need, respect rather than manipulation, peace rather than the exhausting effort of trying to fill holes in other people's lives. I'm not gone, Richard. I'm in every board you cut, every stone you laid, every choice you make to honor what we built together, rather than sacrifice it to what other people think they deserve. Build well, live freely, love wisely. Always and forever yours, Caroline. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my wallet next to the photograph of Ethan in his garden. Different kinds of love, both real, both complicated by the distance that comes when people choose different values to guide their lives. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. its sound echoing through rooms that had witnessed celebrations and sorrows, arguments and reconciliations, the daily accumulation of choices that become a life. Outside, the evening light slanted through the maple grove, painting everything in the golden glow Caroline had said made ordinary moments look like blessings. I made 1 cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, where she and I had shared 47 years of morning conversations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to build or tear down, to protect or surrender, to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in a house that was mine, not because my name was on a deed, but because every detail reflected choices made in the partnership with someone who'd loved me enough to prepare me for a battle I'd hoped never to fight. The phone didn't ring. No one knocked at the door. No one questioned my competence or tried to solve problems I didn't have. In the quiet that surrounded me, I could hear the house breathing, the settling of timber that had held strong for 43 years and would continue holding long after anyone alive to remember its builders had joined them in the ground. It was enough. It was home. It was peace earned through vigilance, love protected by wisdom, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned the difference between family and exploitation just in time to save himself from both. The maple grove rustled in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, and in the house that Caroline and I built together, a man who'd finally learned to guard what mattered most settled into another night of well-earned rest. Right true if you agree with the father character.